The city woke slowly that Sunday morning, its skyline still half asleep. David Bowie had already slipped away, somewhere between sound and silence, between the last note and the next world. 2 days earlier, he'd released Blackstar, an album that now sounded less like music and more like a coded farewell. "Look up here, I'm in heaven," he'd sung. And we didn't listen. He was already there. Blackstar, released January 8th, his birthday. 7 songs that played like a farewell written in code. The opening track's first words were a warning no one understood until it was too late. "Look up here, I'm in heaven." Not a lyric, a location report. He was telling us where he'd gone before we even knew he was leaving. The music video for Lazarus showed Bowie in a hospital bed, eyes bandaged, body trembling, singing about being free this way or no way. He was dying on camera and calling it art. The world watched, mesmerized, assuming it was metaphor. It wasn't. 3 days later, the metaphor became obituary. When news broke, social media went silent in a way it rarely does. No jokes, no hot takes, just millions of people simultaneously realizing they'd witnessed something unprecedented, an artist who'd turned his own death into his final performance, his last reinvention. He'd hidden his 18-month cancer battle from everyone except his closest circle. No farewell tour, no public goodbye, no chance for the world to watch him diminish. Instead, he gave us Blackstar. Strange, beautiful, terrifying, and fully alive until the moment it wasn't. His producer, Tony Visconti, wrote on Facebook, "He always did what he wanted to do, and he wanted to do it his way, and he wanted to do it the best way. His death was no different from his life. A work of art. The funeral was private, Buddhist ceremony. His ashes scattered in Bali according to his wishes. On the small altar, just one photograph, not of David Bowie the man, but of Ziggy Stardust, the alien rock star he'd invented in 1972 and killed in 1973. Even in death, he was reminding us the person matters less than the personas. The self is just another costume. Identity is performance all the way down. But here's what haunted everyone in those first stunned days after his death. Bowie had been working on new music until the end. On his deathbed, sketches for future songs were found on his nightstand. The man was dying and still composing, still creating, still refusing to be just one thing, even if that one thing was a dying patient. He couldn't help himself. Reinvention wasn't what he did, it was what he was. The question that hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. How do you mourn someone who'd spent 50 years teaching us that death is just another change? That endings are really transformations? That nothing is permanent, including especially the self? Bowie had made a career out of disappearing and reappearing as someone new. Was death simply his most complete disappearance yet? And if so, who would he become next? His wife Iman, the Somali supermodel he'd been married to for 24 years, said nothing publicly for weeks. When she finally spoke, it was simple and devastating. "He wasn't my icon. He was my home. Past tense, present grief." The man behind the myths was gone, and no amount of Ziggy Stardust mythology could fill that absence. But to understand David Bowie's death as art, we must first understand his life as the same. To understand why Blackstar felt like a culmination rather than an ending, we must go back to the beginning. To 1947, to Brixton, London, to a world still rebuilding from war. To a boy named David Jones who looked at the rubble around him and decided the only way forward was up, into space, into sound, into selves that didn't exist yet but might, if he imagined them hard enough. Because Bowie's story isn't about a boy who became a star. It's about a boy who became 1,000 stars, each one burning bright and brief, each one designed to self-destruct so the next could be born. It's about an artist who understood that the only way to survive fame was to never be the same person twice, who grasped that reinvention wasn't escape, it was evolution. And it begins, as all myths do, with a child who didn't fit anywhere and decided that if the world had no place for him, he'd invent his own worlds instead. David Robert Jones was born January 8, 1947 in Brixton, South London, into a Britain still grey with post-war exhaustion. Rationing, rubble, rebuilding. His father was a promotions officer for a children's charity. His mother was a cinema usherette who'd later struggle with mental illness. The family was working class, respectable, ordinary in every way except one. David wasn't. Even as a child, he was strange. Not troubled, strange. Curious about everything, satisfied by nothing. While other boys played football, David read science fiction. While they listened to skiffle, he was absorbing Little Richard, Elvis, and sounds his friends didn't have vocabulary for yet. He wasn't rebelling against his environment. He was simply existing adjacent to it, occupying the same physical space but mentally living in a future that hadn't arrived. When he was 9, his father brought home a stack of records. Elvis, Fats Domino, Little Richard. David listened and something rewired. Years later, he'd say, "I saw a cousin of mine dance to Elvis's Hound Dog, and I had never seen her get up and be moved so much by anything. It really impressed me, the power of the music. I started getting records immediately after that, but it wasn't just the music. It was the transformation. Elvis wasn't just a singer. He was a truck driver who became a god. Little Richard wasn't just a performer. He was a queer black man in 1950s America who made the whole world scream his name. These weren't just musicians, they were alchemists. They proved that if you had sound and vision, you could turn yourself into anything. At 13, David learned to play saxophone. At 15, he formed his first band. At 16, he had his first fight. A friend punched him over a girl, permanently paralyzing David's left pupil. His eyes would forever look mismatched, different colors. It was an accident that became an aesthetic. The injury that would later make him look alien, otherworldly, perfect for the roles he'd invent. He attended Bromley Technical High School, where he studied art and design. His teacher, Owen Frampton, father of Peter Frampton, recognized something in the boy. He was quiet but intense, Frampton later recalled. He asked questions other students didn't think to ask. Not, "How do I paint this?" but "Why do we paint at all?" That question, why create art, would haunt Bowie his entire life. He kept journals from age 14 filled with sketches, song fragments, and philosophical questions. What is beauty? Can you be multiple people and still be honest? If I change my name, do I change my soul? These weren't teenage angst. They were the early research notes for a lifetime of experimentation. By 1962, David Jones was playing in local bands with names like the Conrads and the King Bees, chasing a sound he couldn't quite articulate yet. He knew what he didn't want, to sound like everyone else. But what he did want remained elusive. He was searching for a sound, for a self, for a future that didn't look like the gray present surrounding him. Could a working-class boy from Brixton become something unprecedented? Could you be an artist without a clear identity? Or was the shifting itself the art? These were dangerous questions for a teenager in 1960s England, where class was destiny and deviation was suspect. But David had learned early that the most interesting people were always the suspicious ones. In 1966, at 19, David Jones changed his name to David Bowie, borrowing from Jim Bowie and his famous knife, a symbol of cutting through, of sharp edges, of weapons disguised as tools. "I wanted a name that sounded like it could cut," he later said. "Something dangerous but elegant, something American but strange." The name change was his first conscious reinvention, his first acknowledgement that the self is malleable. If your birth name doesn't fit, get a new one. If your identity feels wrong, build a better one. This wasn't deception, It was design. And design, Bowie understood, was how you survived a world that wanted you to be one thing when you knew you were many. His early music flopped, singles that went nowhere, an album that sold barely anything. Anthony Newley-style cabaret mixed with British psychedelia that couldn't find an audience because Bowie himself didn't know who he was yet. He was trying on sounds like clothes, discarding what didn't fit, searching for the frequency that matched his interior frequency. And then, 1969, the moon landing, the whole world watching as humans left Earth for the first time. And David Bowie, 22 years old and commercially invisible, wrote a song about an astronaut who cuts his tether and floats into space, choosing isolation over return. Space oddity, Major Tom, the man who goes so far out he can never come back. It was a hit. Not massive, but enough. Enough to give Bowie his first taste of success. Enough to show him that what the world wanted wasn't David Jones or even David Bowie. It was aliens. Outcasts, characters who lived in the spaces between Earth and elsewhere, people or things that reminded everyone else that normalcy was optional. But success was uncomfortable for someone who'd spent his whole youth on the outside. Being accepted felt like a betrayal of everything that made him interesting. So Bowie did what he'd do for the rest of his life when something threatened to define him. He changed. Between 1969 and 1972, Bowie floundered brilliantly. He released albums, toured, experimented, got married, had a son, watched glam rock emerge. Mark Bolan, Roxy Music, acts that understood rock music was theater and theater was transformation. Bowie absorbed it all, taking notes, stealing aesthetics, synthesizing influences into something that didn't exist yet but was starting to take shape in his imagination. He read science fiction, Heinlein, Asimov, Burgess. He studied kabuki theater. He watched A Clockwork Orange 12 times. He discovered Iggy Pop and Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground, artists who proved you could be commercially unsuccessful and culturally eternal. He began to understand that the goal wasn't hits, it was impact. Not popularity, permanence. And somewhere in 1971, looking in a mirror, probably exhausted, probably high, probably frustrated with being David Bowie, the folk rock troubadour, he had the thought that would change everything. What if I wasn't me? What if instead of being a person playing a character, I became the character? What if I stopped trying to be authentic David Bowie and instead created someone more interesting than authenticity? What if the mask was the truth? And from that question, Ziggy Stardust was born. The year David Bowie committed cultural suicide and was reborn as an alien messiah. The rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars wasn't just an album. It was a mythology, a religion, a declaration that rock music could be theater, art, fashion, and prophecy all at once. Ziggy was a character. An androgynous alien rock star sent to Earth to deliver a message before the world ends in 5 years. He had orange hair, lightning bolt makeup, platform boots, and costumes that looked like they'd been stolen from a glam science fiction future. He sang about starmen waiting in the sky, about being a rock and roll suicide, about alienation and apocalypse and sexuality that couldn't be categorized. Bowie didn't just perform Ziggy. He became him. On stage and off, in interviews and in photographs, David disappeared and Ziggy remained. It was method acting applied to rock music. Total commitment to the persona, the first example of what would later be called postmodern celebrity. Fame as performance art, identity as costume. The shows were spectacles. Bowie as Ziggy would mime fellatio on Mick Ronson's guitar, would strip down to glittering bodysuits, would move like something not quite human, angular and elegant and deeply, thrillingly wrong. Parents were horrified. Critics were confused. Teenagers felt seen for the first time in their lives. Because Ziggy wasn't just alien, he was queer. Bisexual, androgynous, refusing every gender norm. 1972, England held sacred. In interviews, Bowie casually declared, "I'm gay and always have been," which wasn't quite true but was true enough. He was using sexuality the way he used everything else, as material, as rebellion, as a way to make straight society uncomfortable. The boldness of it cannot be overstated. This was pre-pride, pre-acceptance, pre-anything resembling mainstream LGBTQ visibility. This was the era when being openly queer could end your career, get you beaten, get you worse. And Bowie, straight, married with a child, decided to blur those lines anyway, not because he had to, but because the art demanded it. Ziggy wasn't just me, he later said. He was everyone's escape hatch. A place where the weird kids, the queer kids, the kids who didn't fit anywhere could go and feel less alone. Ziggy proved that you didn't have to be normal to be magnificent, that you could be an alien and still be a star. That transformation wasn't running away. It was running toward. The fame came fast and massive. Suddenly Bowie was everywhere. Television, magazines, sold-out concerts across Britain and America. Ziggy was what glam rock had been building toward, the perfect synthesis of Bolan's shimmer, Lou Reed's darkness, and something entirely new that only Bowie could conjure. But fame is a trap for someone who defines himself through change. The more successful Ziggy became, the more Bowie felt imprisoned by him. Fans didn't want David. They wanted the character. Interviewers didn't ask about his process. They asked him to explain Ziggy's mythology. He'd created a monster that was eating its creator. So in July 1973, at the height of Ziggy mania during a concert at London's Hammersmith Odeon, Bowie walked on stage and announced, "This is the last show we'll ever do." The crowd thought he meant the last show of the tour. He meant the last show of Ziggy. He killed his most successful creation in front of a sold-out crowd and walked off stage, leaving everyone, band included, shocked and confused. It was unprecedented. You don't murder your cash cow. You don't destroy the thing that made you famous. Unless you're Bowie, and you understand that the only way to stay alive artistically is to kill yourself repeatedly. That resurrection requires death. That the phoenix isn't a bird, it's a strategy. "I had to kill him," Bowie said later, "or he would have killed me." The character had become too real, too consuming. If he'd continued being Ziggy, he'd have become a tribute act to himself. So he did what he'd do again and again. He burned it down and started over. But what do you become after you've been a god? What's the follow-up to perfection? For most artists, the answer is a pale imitation of your former glory. For Bowie, the answer was something completely different. After Ziggy came Aladdin Sane, Ziggy's evil twin, more rock and roll, more unhinged. After Aladdin came Halloween Jack, the post-apocalyptic street hustler from Diamond Dogs. After Halloween came the Thin White Duke, elegant fascist chic, emotionally frozen, singing about fame and cocaine and the emptiness of winning. Each persona was a costume, a concept, a complete aesthetic overhaul. And beneath all of them, David Bowie was disappearing, losing track of which mask was his face. "I reinvented myself so many times," he admitted. "I can't remember which one is real." This was the dangerous game Bowie played in the mid-70s. He was the most famous rock star in the world, but he had no idea who he was. He'd spent so long being other people that David Jones had dissolved completely, leaving only the characters. And characters without an author become chaos. The cocaine years, 1974-1976. Los Angeles, living on a diet of milk, red peppers, and cocaine, weighing barely 100 pounds. Pale as a corpse, haunted by paranoia, convinced witches were stealing his semen for occult rituals. Reading Nietzsche and Crowley, drawing obsessively, not sleeping, barely eating. The Thin White Duke wasn't just a character. It was what happened when Bowie stopped being human and became pure performance, pure chemicals, pure self-destruction. He gave interviews where he made fascist-adjacent comments about Hitler and Supermen, and the need for Britain to embrace authoritarianism. Later, he'd say he remembered none of it, that he was so deep in addiction and ego dissolution that he'd become a channel for any thought that floated through, no matter how toxic. But the damage was done. Bowie had proven that even the most progressive artist could become dangerous when unmoored from reality. Was fame worth this? Was the art worth losing your mind? Bowie was living the question every icon eventually faces. If you give everything to your art, what's left for your life? In 1976, Bowie hit bottom, collapsing after shows, unable to remember lyrics, seeing things that weren't there. His marriage ended. His body was failing. His mind was fracturing. And he realized with the clarity that comes only from desperation, if he didn't leave Los Angeles, he would die there. So he did what he'd always done when a version of himself became unbearable. He killed it and fled. Berlin, 1976. Bowie moved to West Berlin with Iggy Pop, both of them trying to escape their addictions and their fame. They rented apartments in Schöneberg, a working-class neighborhood where nobody cared about rock stars. They rode bicycles, ate Turkish food, visited museums, tried to remember what it felt like to be human instead of symbol. And in Berlin, surrounded by the wall, by the divided city's strange Cold War energy, Bowie found something he hadn't felt in years. Silence. Not literal silence. Berlin was loud, vibrant, full of punks and artists and refugees. But internal silence. The voices that had been screaming at him for years, be Ziggy, be famous, be more, be different, be everything, finally quieted. He collaborated with Brian Eno, the experimental producer and artist who understood that music didn't need to be songs. It could be textures, atmospheres, emotions without narratives. Together they created what would be called the Berlin Trilogy. Low Heroes Lodger. 3 albums that sounded like nothing in rock music before or since. Electronic, ambient, fractured, beautiful, and cold. The sound of a man putting himself back together piece by piece. The title track of Heroes became Bowie's most enduring song. Not because it was catchy, but because it was true. 2 lovers meeting at the Berlin Wall, knowing their love is temporary, impossible, doomed, but insisting we can be heroes just for one day. Not forever, not permanently, just for one day. The most realistic ambition Bowie had ever sung. In Berlin, Bowie stopped trying to be extraordinary and learned to be ordinary again. He'd go to cafes and read. He'd paint. He'd watch people. He kicked cocaine. He ate real food. He let his natural hair color return. The characters receded, and David, whoever that was, started to emerge. But here's the paradox. It was only by stepping away from fame that Bowie became worthy of it again. The Berlin albums weren't commercial successes initially, but they were artistically revolutionary. They influenced every electronic, post-punk, and new wave artist for the next 40 years. Bowie had stopped trying to be a star and accidentally became a prophet. By 1980, Bowie had recovered enough to return to the spotlight. But he was different now. Older, sober, less interested in personas and more interested in making music that meant something. Scary Monsters was a return to conventional rock, but it was rock filtered through everything Berlin had taught him about space and texture and emotional honesty. And then, 1983. Let's Dance. The album that made Bowie a global superstar, not just a cult figure. The album that betrayed nothing he'd learned in Berlin and embraced pure, shameless pop. It was produced by Nile Rodgers of Chic, funky and accessible and designed to dominate the radio. It worked. Let's Dance was everywhere. Bowie was suddenly playing stadiums, appearing on MTV, becoming the thing he'd always resisted. Mainstream. The 80s Bowie is the version casual fans know best. Blonde, tan, wearing nice suits, singing Modern Love and China Girl, acting in movies like Labyrinth, being handsome and safe and successful. But people who'd followed his career felt betrayed. Where was the danger, the experimentation, the refusal to give audiences what they wanted? Bowie himself seemed unsure. He'd make an album like Tonight that felt like contractual obligation, then try something weird like Outside that confused everyone. The 90s were a wilderness period, respected but not relevant, influential but not innovative. He formed a band called Tin Machine that critics hated. He released albums that sold modestly. He was still David Bowie, still famous, still wealthy, but he'd lost the thread. He'd stopped knowing what he was supposed to be. Was this what happens to all revolutionaries eventually? They either die young or live long enough to become nostalgia acts. Was Bowie doomed to spend his final decades touring behind Ziggy Stardust, giving boomers one more chance to feel young? For a while, it seemed that way. The reality tour in 2003-2004 was massive, successful, and utterly conventional. Just Bowie playing his hits for fans who wanted to remember when he was dangerous instead of watching him be dangerous now. And then, during a show in Germany, he suffered a heart attack on stage. Emergency surgery. Months of recovery. And when he recovered, instead of returning to the grind, Bowie did something shocking. He stopped. No announcement. No farewell tour. He just disappeared. For 10 years, 2006 to 2013, David Bowie was gone. No albums, no interviews, no public appearances. The most public artist of his generation went silent, and the silence was deafening. Rumors circulated. He was sick. He was done. He was living quietly in New York with Iman and their daughter, painting and reading and being a husband and father. He'd given everything to art and decided to take something back. Time, privacy, a life that wasn't performed. People wondered if he'd ever return. Some hoped he would. Others hoped he wouldn't, worried that a comeback would be sad, diminished, proof that legends should stay legendary. Then, January 2013. Out of nowhere, the next day, a new album, no warning, no press tour, just the music appearing like a transmission from someone everyone thought was dead. And it was good, sharp, angry, self-aware. Bowie singing about aging and death and legacy with the same intelligence he'd once applied to alien messiahs. The world exhaled. He was back. But also, he was different. No videos of him. No interviews, no tour. He gave the music and nothing else, refusing to be a personality, insisting that the art speak without the artist explaining it. It was revolutionary in an age of overexposure. Bowie proving that mystery still had power, that absence could be presence. But the next day wasn't a comeback, it was a prelude. Because while the world celebrated his return, Bowie was already planning his exit. In late 2014, Bowie was diagnosed with liver cancer. He told almost no one, Iman, his children, a few close collaborators. He didn't want pity, didn't want the narrative of his life to become about sickness, didn't want his final years consumed by medical bulletins and public grieving. So he kept the secret and began planning the last thing he'd ever make, an album about death that didn't sound like dying. Blackstar, recorded in secret throughout 2015 while undergoing chemotherapy. 7 songs that sound like jazz, like industrial noise, like ritual, like transmission, like prayer. The lyrics oblique but pointed. I'm a black star. Look up here, I'm in heaven. I can't give everything away. He worked with a new producer, new musicians, pushing himself into sounds he'd never explored. Even dying, he refused to repeat himself. Even at the end, he insisted on transformation. This wasn't a greatest hits nostalgia trip. This was something new, something final, something that only made sense after he was gone. The album was scheduled for release January 8, 2016, his 69th birthday. He wanted the gift to be from him to the world, not from the world to him. He wanted to control the narrative one last time. And he did. Blackstar was released Friday. Critical acclaim, confusion about its meaning. The videos, especially Lazarus with Bowie bandaged and shaking in a hospital bed, felt ominous but were dismissed as typical Bowie strangeness. The man had always been death-obsessed. This was just more of that. Sunday morning he died, and suddenly, retroactively, Blackstar transformed from album to eulogy. Every lyric recontextualized, every image now a clue. The whole thing was a goodbye letter written in sound, and only after his death could anyone read it properly. The audacity of it cannot be overstated. Most artists' final works are diminished by death, proof they were failing, evidence of decline. Bowie made an album that only achieved its full meaning through his death. He'd turned dying into a collaboration between artist and listener, a secret revealed only when he was gone. It was the most Bowie thing imaginable. Control the narrative, confuse everyone, disappear on his own terms, leave them wanting more. He wasn't saying goodbye. He was teaching us how to leave. His death dominated global news for weeks. Tributes poured in from every corner of culture. Musicians, actors, artists, writers, politicians. Everyone had a Bowie story. Everyone felt the loss personally. But the grief was strange, complicated by the fact that Bowie had scripted his own death so thoroughly that mourning him felt like participating in his final performance. Iman stayed silent initially, then posted a single photo. David, young and beautiful, with the caption, "The struggle is real, but so is God." No explanation, no elaboration. The private grief behind the public mythology. His children were similarly quiet. His son, Duncan Jones, a filmmaker, tweeted simply, "Very sorry and sad to say it's true, I'll be offline for a while, love to all." The funeral was small and private, Buddhist ceremony as per his wishes. His body cremated, ashes scattered in Bali. No public memorial, no chance for the world to turn his death into spectacle. Even in death, Bowie refused to be consumed, but the art remained. 50 years of albums, personas, transformations. Ziggy and the Duke and Major Tom and all the others. The influence impossible to calculate. Every artist who ever changed their sound, their look, their name. Every performer who understood that identity is costume and costume is power. Every queer kid who learned that difference can be power instead of shame. Bowie's legacy isn't his songs, though the songs are remarkable. It's the idea he embodied, that you don't have to be one thing. That reinvention isn't betrayal, it's evolution. That the self is not fixed but fluid, not discovered but invented. That you can be many people and still be honest, because honesty isn't consistency, it's courage. In death, conspiracy theories emerged, as they always do. Some claimed he'd faked it, that he'd simply invented death as his final persona and would return. Others insisted the cancer was from his cocaine years. Cosmic justice for excess. None of it true, but all of it revealing. People couldn't accept that Bowie had died like everyone else. He was supposed to transcend even that, but he didn't transcend death. He transformed it. He made it art. He proved that even ending can be creation, that even disappearing can be intentional, that even dying can be done with style. Years later, his journals were partially published. They revealed what people who knew him always said. Beneath the personas was a genuinely kind, curious, intelligent man. He loved his wife and children. He read philosophy. He believed in art's power to change consciousness. He was shy at parties, he cried at movies, he was underneath everything human. But he'd spent his career arguing that being human wasn't enough. That we could be more, stranger, freer. That limitation was a choice, and transformation was always available. That tomorrow belonged to those who could hear it coming, and he'd always had the best ears in the room. On the small altar at his private memorial, alongside the photo of Ziggy Stardust, someone placed a note. It read, "He told us we could be heroes just for one day. He was a hero every day, including the last." David Bowie spent his life proving that identity is performance, that the self is a story you tell yourself, that change is the only constant. He became Major Tom, Ziggy, Aladdin, Halloween Jack, the Duke, the Sovereign, and 100 other characters nobody named. He showed us that you could be everything and nothing, famous and private, star and human all at once. His final gift was Blackstar, proof that even death is just another transformation, another costume change, another way of saying, I was here, I became something, and now I'm becoming something else. The last photograph taken of him shows a man in a black coat, smiling, looking directly at the camera with those mismatched eyes. He looks tired but peaceful, sick but alive, ending but unfinished. Because that's the real secret Bowie spent 50 years trying to tell us. Nobody is ever finished. We're all unfinished light, all works in progress, all becoming until we stop. And even then the art remains. The influence spreads. The story continues. Somewhere a teenager is listening to Ziggy Stardust for the first time and realizing they don't have to be who their parents expected. Somewhere an artist is taking a risk because Bowie taught them that safety is death. Somewhere someone is changing and changing and changing because he showed us how. The last words David Bowie wrote, found on his nightstand after his death, were lyrics for a song he'd never finish. I can't give everything away. But he did. He gave everything. All the selves he invented, all the sounds he pioneered, all the beauty and strangeness and courage he could summon. What he kept was just the ending, and even that he made art. On clear nights, if you know where to look, you can see the constellation named for him. An asteroid belt in space called 342843 David Bowie, approved by the International Astronomical Union weeks after his death. He's up there now, or the idea of him is. The myth that mattered more than the man. But here on Earth, in quiet moments, his wife Iman sometimes plays Blackstar. Not to mourn, to remember. To hear his voice making beauty from darkness. To be reminded that he left the way he lived, transformed, mysterious, magnificent, and completely himself. Whoever that was, whatever that meant, David Bowie taught us that we don't need to know who we are. We just need to keep becoming, keep changing, keep transforming. Until the final transformation comes, and even then leave something beautiful behind. He did, he was, he is, and somewhere the next child who refuses to fit in is already tuning his guitar. The struggle is real, but so is God, and so is art, and so was he. Look up here. He's in heaven, he's in space, he's in sound, he's in everyone who ever decided that normal was negotiable and transformation was possible. He's not gone, he's just changed again. And silence was just another song. And this time he became everything, including finally free. If death can be designed, is immortality still rebellion? And when becoming replaces being, where does the soul finally rest?